Thanks so much, Sarah. Hi everyone, it's really great to be here this afternoon, and thanks for sticking around for the very last session. So today I'll be presenting on insights from eSafety's image-based abuse reporting and removal scheme. Before I begin, I will just note that the findings are currently under embargo until April 28th, when they'll be published in the Journal of Online Trust and Safety. So I just ask that no one shares any photos of the slides or anything until then. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to First Nations people and to elders past and present. Just a bit of an agenda of what I'll cover today. I'll start off by highlighting some kind of background literature and relevant previous findings. I'll then provide a very brief overview of eSafety's image-based abuse, or IBA scheme. The bulk of the presentation will then focus on the nature of and trends in reports to eSafety's IBA scheme over its first 5 years of operation, and I'll finish up with a quick discussion and highlight some key implications. Now, as we know, advances in digital technology have really provided the opportunity for new ways for sexual violence to be perpetrated, including technology-facilitated sexual violence. Image-based abuse, or IBA, is one form of technology-facilitated sexual violence, which includes three key forms, these being the non-consensual creation or possession of intimate images, the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, or threats to share intimate images. Now, IBA is a really diverse form of abuse, and the characteristics do really vary widely between cases. So the images involved might have been created by the victim survivor consensually or produced consensually in the context of a romantic relationship. They might have been created coercively. They might have been taken during a sexual assault, covertly produced, or hacked or stolen. They might have also been digitally altered, for example, deepfakes. Perpetrators of IBA can include current or former partners, family members, friends, acquaintances, as well as persons unknown to the victim survivor, including organised criminal groups. The motivations can also be really diverse. They can include control, revenge, sexual or monetary gratification, harassment, humiliation, misogyny or entitlement, or bullying, or to achieve status among peers, for example, when nude images are circulated among peers in a school context. IBA also frequently co-occurs with other forms of abuse, such as unwanted communication, threats of harm, controlling behaviour, or physical harm. IBA also includes sexual extortion, which we've already heard about a lot throughout this conference, and it involves when someone threatens to share an intimate image unless the victim gives in to certain demands. So this could be for money in the case of financial sexual extortion, for more intimate images, or sexual favours. Now, recent research suggests that unfortunately the prevalence of IBA, both in Australia and across the world, is on the rise. So a 2019 study involving participants aged 16 to 64 in Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom found that over 1 in 3 participants had experienced IBA since the age of 16. This compares to an earlier Australian study conducted in 2016 that found that 1 in 5 participants had experienced IBA. Reports of IBA to various helplines have also increased over recent years. For example, analysis of reports to the United Kingdom's revenge porn helpline found a 106% increase in reports of IBA from 2022 to 23, with reports involving sexual extortion largely accounting for that increase. Regarding gender differences, studies to date have largely explored gender dynamics between women and men and have really revealed mixed findings, with some studies finding higher prevalence among women compared with men, others finding the opposite, and others still finding no gender differences. However, there do really seem to be gendered patterns in the nature, extent, and impact of victimisation. For example, recent surveys and reporting data have generally shown that men are more likely than women to receive threats to share intimate images, particularly in the context of financial sexual extortion. So, for example, during 2023, 93% of reports to the UK's revenge porn helpline involving sexual extortion affected men, whereas over 70% of reports which involved threats to share intimate images or images being shared without consent, not in the context of sexual extortion, affected women. Women were also disproportionately impacted by the quantity of intimate images shared without their consent, with women having about 28 times more intimate images shared non-consensually compared with men. Unfortunately, IBA among children and young people also appears to have increased over recent years. For example, analysis of reports to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children cyber tip line showed an increase in reports of sexual extortion of children from 2020 to 2023, with this increase largely driven by reports of financial sexual extortion. Mirroring similar gender dynamics as seen in adults, 90% of victims of financial sexual extortion were young boys aged 14 to 17. Whereas sexual extortion that involved kind of demand for content or other demands such as returning to or entering into a romantic relationship more commonly involved girls. Alongside this growing prevalence in IBA, there has been a real growing recognition of this lack of transparency from platforms about content moderation, as well as this real power platforms have over what users can share online, and this real discretion to kind of create and enforce their own rules and guidelines. In light of this, governments are focusing on the introduction of new regulatory schemes to attempt to better hold technology companies accountable for hosting harmful content, including IBA, on their servers. Now, eSafety is the first government agency to implement a dedicated, support-oriented scheme for victim survivors of IBA that doesn't require engagement with law enforcement or the criminal justice system if that's not what the victim survivor desires. Under the scheme, eSafety is responsible for facilitating the removal of non-consensual intimate images that have been posted online via the establishment of a reporting portal and civil penalty scheme. Under the scheme, eSafety can receive reports and take action when an intimate image has been non-consensually shared online or when there has been a threat to share an intimate image. Complaints to the scheme are triaged and actioned by eSafety investigators, and based on the details in the complaint form and any further information provided by the complainant, categorised as one particular type of behaviour, some of which I'm showing on the screen here. So as you can see, these key categories include sexual extortion, intimate content that has been publicly posted online, content that has been shared via private means, threatened sharing outside of sexual extortion, impersonation accounts, IBA in the context of coercive control, or posted or threatened sharing where the images are considered intimate as they depict the victim survivor without religious or cultural attire that they would normally wear in public. Other key types of behaviour include digitally altered intimate images that have been captured without consent, intimate content that appears to depict the victim survivor, child sexual exploitation, and peer group sharing or threatened sharing. Now, one limitation to flag with our analyses is that each report is only categorised as one of these types of behaviours. Of course, the assigned category might not capture the entirety of a victim survivor's experience, and therefore it's likely that some of these categories are underrepresented in the reporting data. It's also worth flagging that these categories have evolved over time, and there is likely some inconsistency in how categories have been used throughout the duration of the reporting period. Notwithstanding these limitations, we aim to examine how the IBA scheme has operated over its first 5 years of operation. So that's from August 2018 to June 2023. Specifically, our analyses aim to address the following research questions. 1, how many reports and from whom did eSafety receive between 2018 and 2023? 2, what were the most common categories of behaviour reported to the scheme? 3, how did the prevalence and nature of reports change over time? And 4, what actions did eSafety take in response to reports? So jumping straight into research question 1, We found that eSafety handled almost 19,500 reports under the IBA scheme in its first 5 years of operation. Of these reports, about 62% involved male victims, about 35% involved female victims, 0.6% involved victims who identified as transgender, gender diverse, or intersex, and 2% involved victims who identified as another gender or who preferred not to disclose their gender. Now, because of these relatively low numbers of reports from transgender and gender diverse victim survivors, we have only been able to compare characteristics of reports received from male and female victims. However, we do of course acknowledge that transgender and gender diverse individuals are at greater risk of harm online, and more research is really needed to understand their lived experiences of IBA. Looking at age differences, we can see that over 40% of all reports involved young victims aged 18 to 24, while just over 30% involved victims aged 25 plus. There were a similar number of reports from teens aged 13 to 15 and 16 to 17 at around 11%, and just under 2% from victims under 13. Notably, almost a third of all reports involved male victims aged 18 to 24. Moving on to research question 2, and I'm just highlighting on the screen here the most common categories of reports, so the other categories not shown were involved in less than 2% of reports. As you can see, over 3/4 of all reports were categorised as sexual extortion or child sexual exploitation. Sexual extortion accounted for a majority of all reports at just over 62%, while almost 15% were categorised as child sexual exploitation. Around 5% of reports were categorised as being publicly posted online, while just under 4% were categorised as peer group sharing or threatened sharing. Around 2% each involved content being shared via private means, threatened sharing outside of sexual extortion, or coercive control. Looking at differences between male and female victims among these more prevalent categories of reports, we can see in the top 2 bars that reports categorised as sexual extortion or child sexual exploitation predominantly involved male victims. Conversely, reports categorised as threatened sharing or non-consensual sharing outside of sexual extortion, posted online, or peer group sharing overwhelmingly involved female victims. Looking now at age differences, among reports categorised as sexual extortion, which is the top bar on the screen, 60% of victims were aged 18 to 24. Among reports categorised as child sexual exploitation, just over half of victims were 16 to 17, while about 40% were younger teens aged 13 to 15. Among reports categorised as threatened or non-consensual sharing or posted online, most victims were aged 25 plus. Finally, among reports categorised as peer group sharing, most victims were younger teens aged 13 to 15. Moving on to research question 3, looking at changes over time. And this first figure here is plotting reports overall, with the green line showing reports overall, the darker blue showing reports from male victims, and the lighter blue reports from female victims. And we can see there was a really substantial increase in report numbers across time, increasing by almost 1,000%. Looking at differences between male and female victims across time, we can see that in the first 2 financial years of the scheme, there were slightly more reports involving female victims. However, this pattern reversed in 2020 with this real steep increase in reports from male victims from 2021 onwards. While reports involving female victims increased to a lesser extent, there was nonetheless still an increase across time. Looking now at reports categorised as sexual extortion, again we see that really substantial increase across time, this time by over 1,300%. We can see there were consistently more reports of sexual extortion involving male victims. However, again we see that really substantial increase from 2021 onwards. Now looking at reports categorised as child sexual exploitation, again there was a really significant increase across the scheme's first 5 years, this time by over 2,200%. Now here we can see there were initially more reports of child sexual exploitation involving female victims. However, again we see this pattern reversing with a steep increase in reports from male victims, this time from 2020 onwards. Looking at all other report types combined, so excluding sexual extortion and child sexual exploitation, there was a 300% increase across time, with consistently more reports of these other types of IBA behaviours involving female victims. Finally, moving on to research question 4. So eSafety can really take a range of actions in relation to complaints and will typically engage with platforms informally in the first instance. So during the reporting period, eSafety issued about 9,500 reports of user behaviour, so essentially reporting our perpetrator accounts to online services, with 80% of these leading to removal of perpetrator accounts. In reports where intimate images have been publicly posted, the rapid removal of these images is the priority. And to respond quickly, this stream of response involves contacting the online services and requesting the removal of those non-consensual images. So eSafety sent almost 2,000 removal requests, with about 90% of these leading to removal of some or all of the content. When removal requests made to platforms are unsuccessful, steps can be taken to limit the discoverability of intimate images that have been posted publicly by having them removed from search engine results. So eSafety informally requested the de-indexing of search engine results on 104 instances. In addition to these actions, eSafety responds to reports with kind of education, referrals, information and advice. So just to wrap up with a quick discussion, our analyses revealed that the implementation of the IBA scheme has really provided an increasing number of Australian victim survivors with expert assistance and practical support to help them feel safer online, reclaim control, and to facilitate the removal of harmful content. The scheme really removes the onus on victim survivors to seek out their intimate images online, to contact and report to individual platforms, and to attempt to convince platforms or perpetrators to remove their intimate images. When IBA is reported under the scheme, there are no requirements to prove motivation or intent in the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, and IBA arising across diverse contexts and motivations is captured under the scheme. The scheme also takes an inclusive approach to the definition of an intimate image, extending to diverse forms of images that the victim survivor hasn't chosen to share publicly. This inclusive threshold of what constitutes IBA has really facilitated an unanticipated increasing number of reports under the scheme, which have been especially driven by the very high proportion and increasing rates of sexual extortion and child sexual exploitation. Now, these increasing rates of sexual extortion and child sexual exploitation are reported to the scheme, especially reports involving young male victims, really does mirror international findings. So, for example, the United Kingdom's revenge porn helpline saw a 54% increase in reports of sexual extortion from 2022 to 2023, with 93% of reports of sexual extortion involving male victims. Analysis of NCMEC cyber tipline data similarly showed an increase in reports of sexual extortion from 2020 to 2023, with this increase largely driven by reports involving financial sexual extortion. Again, 90% of victims of financial sexual extortion were boys aged 14 to 17. Finally, a recent survey, which many of us might have heard about this morning, involving about 2,000 adolescents aged 16 to 18 in Australia, found that men were more likely than women to report a recent sexual extortion experience and were also more likely to receive financial demands from perpetrators, while women were more likely to receive demands for additional intimate material. Now, while it wasn't within the scope of our analyses to analyse the demands the victims of sexual extortion or child sexual exploitation received, Collectively, these findings do really point towards a surge in incidents of sexual extortion, especially financial sexual extortion in recent years, predominantly targeting young men and boys. However, our findings do suggest that other forms of IBA, including sharing and threatened sharing outside of sexual extortion, continue to be more commonly reported by women and girls. Now, even though platforms are typically willing to comply with the increasing number of requests from eSafety to remove content from their services, it does appear that really little is being done to prevent or proactively respond to IBA occurring on their services. The increasing number of reports to the scheme highlights that online services do really need to be doing more to respond to IBA. There's really a need for platforms to have accessible and effective reporting and moderation processes in particular. However, we know that many people are unable or unwilling to report their IBA experiences, and I think we heard this morning that only about 10% of victim survivors reported to an organisation like eSafety or to the police. So the reporting numbers I've presented today are likely to be a significant underestimation of the prevalence of IBA in Australia. Proactive detection of IBA occurring on platforms is therefore also really needed to help combat IBA or to prevent it from occurring in the first place. Technology-based detection and intervention is especially critical for IBA involving sexual extortion perpetrated by overseas criminals, where identifying and holding the perpetrator to account can be more challenging. Community awareness and preventative education, as well as investments in initiatives that destigmatise and de-shame IBA and encourage help seeking, especially among those more at risk or those who might be most reluctant to seek help, will also be really important in the prevention of IBA. Ultimately, however, responsibility and accountability for IBA does primarily sit with perpetrators, and sexual violence prevention and response work will be critical to reducing IBA perpetration rates. Thanks so much.